I saw it. I saw the flames engulf her, watched as she, the greatest heroine of France, burned at the stake. The king she had elevated to the throne didn't lift a finger. How could I, her contemporary, who had witnessed her incredible triumphs, allow such a disgraceful end? Prepare yourselves for today. A man who saw everything with his own eyes, will tell you the true shocking story of Joan of Arc, the girl who changed the world only to be betrayed by it. I remember that moment, standing in the square in Rouen. The fire consumed her, but in Joan's eyes an unshakable faith burned, and the name of Jesus was on her lips until her last breath. In that very instant I realized, before me was not merely an executed heretic, but the living embodiment of the greatest hope, which, though destined for such a terrible end, had already irrevocably altered the course of all history. How could this have happened? How did a simple, illiterate peasant girl, barely out of childhood, manage to lead entire armies, inspire a king, and turn the tide of the 100 Years' War? Her life is a labyrinth of mysteries, shocking revelations, and incredible triumphs that has captivated everyone for 6 centuries. Today, I will immerse you in the darkest and brightest pages of Joan of Arc's destiny. We will try to understand, was she a sincere saint, guided by higher powers, or was she cleverly used in a grand political game by kings and bishops? Were her visions truly divine revelations or merely hallucinations born of deep faith and superhuman stress? And why, even centuries later, does she remain one of the most mysterious and inspiring figures in history? Let us embark together on this captivating journey to uncover the secrets of Joan of Arc's personality and destiny. To fully grasp the magnitude of Joan of Arc's personality and achievements, we must immerse ourselves in the era where she was born and raised. Imagine 15th century France. It was not merely a country, but a tormented, bloodied land. It was ravaged, devastated by endless wars. Famine and disease reigned everywhere, like merciless predators. I saw cities turn into flame-engulfed ruins, entire regions seized by enemies, and the people almost entirely lose their last hope of salvation. It was into this utter darkness, at this most desperate moment, that a truly incredible figure emerged onto the historical stage, Joan of Arc. A simple girl from a tiny village, an illiterate peasant barely 17 years old, suddenly declared that she heard the voices of saints calling her to save France. Early 15th century France was an era when the country found itself in the grip of a prolonged, bloody conflict, which we know today as the 100 Years' War. I witnessed this struggle, raging from 1337 to 1453, that is, for 116 years, transform flourishing lands into a barren wasteland, making it one of the most destructive and merciless conflicts of the Middle Ages. The roots of this deadly clash delved deep into the tangled question of French succession. In 1328, the French king Charles IV the Fair, the last direct male-line descendant of the Capetian dynasty, died. He left no male heirs, and this instantly plunged the country into a severe political crisis. The English King Edward III, being the grandson of the French King Philip IV the Fair through the female line, quickly asserted that he was the closest and sole legitimate claimant to the French throne. However, the French nobility and clergy categorically refused to recognize succession through the female line, citing the ancient Salic law, which stipulated that only men could inherit the crown. As a result, a representative of the new Valois dynasty, Philip VI, the previous king's nephew, was elevated to the throne of France. Edward III, refusing to acknowledge this decision, perceived it as a profound personal insult and a flagrant violation of his legitimate rights. And so, in 1337, he officially declared war on France, initiating a long, exhausting, and truly tragic conflict. Initially, I must admit, fortune certainly smiled upon the English. I still vividly remember how, in 1346, at the Battle of Crécy, English forces under Edward III inflicted a crushing defeat on a numerically superior French army. The English victory was made possible by the masterful skill of their archers. I saw how the arrows from their longbows, with incredible ease, pierced seemingly impenetrable French armor. This battle forever entered history as one of England's most brilliant victories and ruthlessly exposed all the weaknesses of traditional French military strategy. Just 10 years later, in 1356, I witnessed yet another catastrophe for the French, the Battle of Poitiers. Here, Edward III's son, known as Edward the Black Prince, once again routed the French army, and, oh horror, even captured the French King John II the Good himself. The monarch was taken to England, and this was not just a defeat, but an inconceivable, devastating humiliation for all of France. The country plunged into chaos and anarchy. Mass uprisings of peasants and townspeople began. Agriculture and the economy fell into complete, irreversible decline. The war continued with varying success, interrupted only by brief, fragile truces. However, the truly decisive, fatal blow to France was dealt in 1415, when the young, ambitious English king Henry V landed in the north of the country and engaged in the famous Battle of Agincourt. Despite the overwhelming numerical superiority of the French, the English once again crushed their opponents, demonstrating superior tactics and iron discipline. After this catastrophic defeat, the French were morally broken, their will to resist almost exhausted. The English captured Paris and gained control of most of northern France. By this point, France found itself on the very brink of an abyss, on the verge of complete disappearance as an independent state. Powerful, influential provinces such as Burgundy began to act entirely independently, often entering into open alliances with the English against the central French authority. King Charles VI the Mad had virtually lost all power due to severe illness and mental disorder. The country plunged into absolute political chaos, and I saw with my own eyes how this all-consuming hopelessness suffocated any spark of life. Against the backdrop of these unprecedented catastrophic events, the common people of France endured unimaginable, horrifying suffering. Endless wars mercilessly destroyed harvests, provoked deadly epidemics, and caused widespread famine. Many peasants and townspeople were instantly deprived of their homes, all their possessions, and their livelihoods, forced to wander, beg, and die on the roads. Poverty, disease, and an all-encompassing, paralyzing fear became an inseparable part of every Frenchman's daily life. I still remember their faces, gaunt, emaciated, desperate, yet clinging to a faint glimmer of hope in the deepest recesses of their souls. Far from the bustle of large cities, amidst endless green meadows, ancient forests, and rolling hills of Lorraine, lay the tiny village of Domremy. This place seemed almost untouched by civilization, alien to the noise and upheavals of the outside world. Here, people's lives followed their course, governed only by natural cycles and the age-old routine of rural labor, which had changed little over the past 100 or even 200 years. It was here, in a simple yet sturdy peasant family, that a girl destined to change history was born in 1412. Her family, whose surname the world would later know as Dark, was unremarkable among the villagers, but commanded unquestionable respect for their unshakable honesty and incredible diligence. Joan's father, Jacques d'Arc, was a man of stern, flinty character. Straightforward, strict, yet undeniably fair. He worked his small plot of land, grew grain, raised livestock, kept his household in exemplary order, and was sometimes elected village elder. I saw how Jacques strived with all his might to raise his children in a spirit of iron discipline, deep respect for labor, and the strictest moral principles. There was not a single corner in his house for idleness or laziness. He detested laziness and constantly ensured that his children were always engaged in useful, meaningful activities. Joan's mother, Isabelle Romay, was the complete opposite of her husband. A gentle, kind, warm-hearted, and deeply devoutly religious woman, it was she who, from an early age, taught Joan, her brothers, and her sister to pray, told them touching biblical stories, and instilled in them a spirit of compassion and mercy towards others. Isabelle was not merely the keeper of the hearth. She was the true spiritual guide of the entire family. Thanks to her, the children grew up in an atmosphere of sincere kindness, boundless love, and unshakable faith, learning patience and compassion, qualities so vital in those monstrously difficult times. Joan, being the fourth child, grew up closely surrounded by her brothers and sister, daily contributing to all family chores and arduous tasks. From an early age, she helped her mother prepare food, keep the house clean, wash clothes, and tend to the livestock. As the girl grew a little older, her father entrusted her with heavier work, caring for animals, harvesting crops, and assisting with exhausting field labor. All this from a young age accustomed Joan to hard physical labor, and instilled in her unyielding responsibility. Even then, from childhood, neighbors noted her unusual seriousness, deep thoughtfulness, and surprising independence, especially for her age. Joan never complained about difficulties, nor tried to avoid work, always showing striking maturity and diligence. Unlike her peers who happily spent time socializing, playing, and dancing after arduous workdays, Joan preferred silence and deep solitude. She often went to the outskirts of the village, where she would sit alone for long periods, lost in contemplation or prayer. This strikingly distinguished her from other residents of Domremy, making her a subject of close attention and genuine surprise among neighbors. They saw in her not just an unusual girl, but a person with a peculiar inner world, full of thoughts that were profound and not entirely comprehensible to them. Thus, the environment of the small village, the harsh daily life, the simple but firm morality of her father, and the tender religiosity of her mother laid the unshakable foundations of Joan of Arc's character and worldview. It was in this humble, seemingly even primitive rural environment that the girl grew and strengthened, who was one day destined to lead an entire army and inspire a nation to a desperate fight for its independence. When Joan was about 13 years old, her life suddenly and most incredibly changed. One afternoon, while she was in the quiet of her garden at home, the girl first heard mysterious voices. This event became an absolute turning point in her destiny. At first, Joan dared not tell anyone about it, fearing misunderstanding and ridicule. According to her own words, the first to appear before her were Archangel Michael and Saints Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch. They appeared to her as bright glowing figures, enveloped in unearthly light. The voices of the saints were gentle, yet surprisingly persistent and clear. They spoke to her simply and understandably, urging her to be pious, virtuous, and to unfailingly follow the will of God. But the most astounding revelation was that after some time they revealed her great mission to her: to liberate France from the English invaders and help the rightful French king be crowned in the sacred city of Reims. I heard that these visions recurred regularly, sometimes several times a week. Joan perceived them not as ephemeral hallucinations or deceptive dreams, but as entirely real, tangible events. She felt chosen, but at the same time, she was overwhelmed by apprehension and even fear at the colossal responsibility that had suddenly fallen upon her fragile shoulders. Initially, Joan kept her visions a profound secret. However, her behavior gradually began to change noticeably, and naturally, those around her couldn't help but notice. While before, she had simply been a quiet, serious girl, now she became even more withdrawn and introspective. She would often disappear for long periods, going into the depths of the forest or to the small village chapel, where she spent much time in prayers and deep contemplation. Her family and neighbors initially reacted cautiously but with patience, assuming these were merely eccentricities of age or manifestations of excessive piety. However, over time, her behavior began to cause serious concern and sometimes outright bewilderment. People began openly saying she was strange, not like everyone else. Some villagers even began to suspect that Joan was under the influence of evil spirits or witchcraft. Sinister rumors spread through the village that the girl had lost her mind and shouldn't be trusted. The family's reaction was particularly difficult. Her father, a strict and pragmatic man, took his daughter's behavior hard, seeing her actions and words as manifestations of dangerous pride or even illness. I heard him say with despair that he would rather drown her with his own hands than let his daughter disgrace the family and the entire village. Joan's mother, Isabel, though greatly disturbed by her daughter's behavior, still showed more understanding and sympathy, deeply sensing that her daughter was experiencing something profoundly important, perhaps even sacred. Nevertheless, despite this difficult and at times hostile reaction from family and neighbors, Joan never wavered from her convictions. She continued to assert with unshakable conviction that the voices of the saints were real, that they were neither dreams nor illness, and that she was ready to do anything to fulfill her divine destiny. It was this absolute faith in her mission and her phenomenal ability to withstand external pressure that set Joan apart from thousands of other village girls and laid the unshakable foundation of her incredible destiny, which would soon shake all of France and forever change the course of world history. In the 15th century, the Catholic Church's attitude towards mystical revelations and visions was extremely complex and ambiguous, much like Janus, the two-faced god. On the one hand, The Church, of course, recognized the possibility of divine intervention and actively encouraged the veneration of saints, many of whom claimed to receive revelations and prophecies directly from God or saints. Such revered figures as Saint Catherine of Siena or Saint Bridget of Sweden were considered respected and worthy of veneration, despite their highly unusual spiritual experiences. On the other hand, the Church was mortally afraid of the spread of false prophets and dangerous heresies, capable of undermining its undeniable authority or leading the faithful astray. Any mystical revelation at that time was subjected to meticulous, relentless scrutiny and strict control by ecclesiastical authorities. Usually, spiritual directors or esteemed theologians thoroughly examined the statements of people reporting their visions to determine their veracity. A person relating mystical revelations had to show the deepest humility, absolute obedience to the Church, and demonstrate exceptional spiritual purity. If, however, the visions were accompanied by signs of pride, disobedience to spiritual authorities, or questionable moral conduct, such individuals were immediately declared either demon-possessed, blatant charlatans, or simply insane. When Joan first dared to speak of her visions, many residents of Domremy and local priests met her words with great skepticism. However, there were several compelling reasons why she was not immediately declared insane or a heretic. Firstly, Joan's conduct was absolutely irreproachable from the perspective of all Christian moral norms. She was pious, modest, kind-hearted, prayed regularly, and sincerely, wholeheartedly followed all religious canons. She did not seek glory, demand attention, or show the slightest signs of pride, which usually aroused suspicion in the Church. Secondly, Joan spoke of her visions calmly, incredibly clearly, and remarkably convincingly. Her words were logical and clear, unlike the incoherent ramblings of madmen or charlatans who could be easily exposed. She presented the details of her revelations so plausibly and consistently that even experienced spiritual directors could not immediately dismiss her words. Furthermore, the historical context played a crucial role. France was in a truly catastrophic situation, and the people desperately, wholeheartedly awaited a miracle sent from above. The Church simply could not ignore the public mood, especially when ordinary people began to see Joan as a potential savior, sent by God himself. Local priests themselves, and even some representatives of the higher clergy, secretly hoped that Joan's visions would prove authentic and help the country finally achieve peace and stability. And finally, the Church and secular authorities presciently saw in Joan a powerful potential political instrument that could be used to strengthen the king's authority and unite the people against an external enemy. If she had been immediately declared mad or possessed, the opportunity to utilize her colossal influence and authority among the common people would have been irrevocably lost. That is why, instead of immediate condemnation, it was decided to subject Joan to the most rigorous scrutiny, sending her for discussions with esteemed theologians and learned clerics. She endured exhaustive interrogations, the strictest tests for sincerity and moral purity. When it became evident that Joan was successfully passing all these tests and giving clear, convincing answers, her mission was deemed worthy of consideration, allowing her to go to the king. Thus, the Church's attitude towards Joan and her revelations was cautious, but ultimately favorable. As a result of a deep analysis and verification of her behavior and convictions, instead of accusing her of madness or heresy, the ecclesiastical authorities virtually approved her mission, giving Joan the opportunity to become the fateful figure who changed the course of French history. When Joan finally confirmed her calling, to liberate France and lead the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII, to his sacred coronation, she understood that the only way to accomplish this mission was through a personal meeting with him. It was an incredibly audacious, desperately risky undertaking, I tell you. A simple peasant girl, barely out of childhood, was going to personally meet with the country's highest authority, the future king. Joan was filled with unyielding determination. She went to the nearest fortified town, Vaucouleurs, where Captain Robert de Baudricourt was stationed. A man known for his stern disposition and pragmatic, rational thinking, he was a man of action, cautious and extremely distrustful, and initially treated Joan with deep skepticism and even outright derision. Indeed, from the perspective of any sensible person of that time, the idea of a young peasant girl claiming to be sent by God to save France seemed pure madness and absurdity. However, Joan was incredibly persistent and had no intention of backing down. She began regularly visiting Robert de Baudricourt, repeating her requests and confidently, firmly stating that she needed to meet the Dauphin. Despite his initial categorical refusal, the girl persistently returned again and again, convincing him that she was indeed sent by the Almighty. Her absolute conviction, striking simplicity, and profound seriousness gradually began to impress the captain. Meanwhile, rumors about the strange peasant girl and her incredible mission began to spread rapidly throughout Vaucouleurs and its surroundings. Ordinary people, desperately awaiting any kind of miracle, began actively supporting Joan, and some even saw her appearance as a true sign from God. This powerful public pressure and the deep faith of the people also played a significant role in Robert de Baudricourt's decision. The final decision came after Joan made a bold and utterly unexpected prophecy. She informed the captain of a major French military defeat near Orléans, of which there was no prior knowledge in Vaucouleurs. And then, just a few days later, this news was indeed confirmed, shocking de Baudricourt and making him seriously, deeply ponder Joan's words. Now, surprised and bewildered, Robert de Baudricourt decided, if Joan truly possessed such a gift, then perhaps it was worth giving her a chance. He agreed to send her to Chinon, where Charles VII was, but stipulated his conditions. Joan had to travel under reliable escort and, importantly, disguise herself in men's clothing for her own safety, to avoid unwanted attention and potential attacks on the road. Thus began her legendary journey from Vaucouleurs to Chinon. Accompanied by a small group of warriors and attendants, Joan set off on a path fraught with unpredictable dangers and unknowns. Despite the fear of bandits, English and Burgundian soldiers, the girl remained calm and absolutely confident, convinced that God himself would protect her on this risky journey. After several days of arduous travel, bypassing hostile territories and avoiding confrontations, Joan finally arrived in Chinon, to the Dauphin. It was here that she was to face her most important test and prove to the future king that the Lord himself had sent her to save France. When Joan stepped into the light-filled castle hall brimming with noblemen, she showed not the slightest disorientation nor a shadow of hesitation. Disregarding the person sitting on the throne and confidently bypassing him, Joan walked straight into the throng precisely to where the disguised Dauphin Charles stood. Then, humbly but with incredible conviction, she knelt before him and uttered words that, I am sure, shook every person present to their core. In the name of the Lord God, you are the true heir of France and the future king. It is you whom I must lead to Reims for sacred coronation. According to eyewitness accounts, the Dauphin was deeply struck, though he tried not to show it. He asked Joan how she had managed to recognize him among so many courtiers, to which she firmly replied that she had been led by God's will and the unambiguous instructions of the saints' voices. According to contemporary accounts, Joan also revealed something very personal and intimate to Charles, something known only to him, and this definitively convinced the Dauphin that before him stood not just an unusual girl, but a person endowed with a special divine mission. A curious historical fact is why Charles VII dared to undertake such an unusual test at all. The reason lay not only in his personal doubts and fears, but also in the suffocating atmosphere of court intrigues. By this time, many influential courtiers distrusted the Dauphin and made every effort to discredit him. Charles well understood that the appearance of a figure like Joan could become both a powerful argument in his favor and a cunning trap orchestrated by his enemies. By testing her this way, he could simultaneously ascertain her authenticity and demonstrate to both courtiers and his opponents that he was acting with the utmost caution and sound judgment. The success of this trial became an absolute turning point not only for Joan herself, but for all of France. From this day forward, she was officially recognized as a person sent by God, capable of turning the tide of the war. Now, nothing prevented her from embarking on her great mission and leading the French army to the liberation of Orléans and the subsequent coronation of Charles VII in Reims. By early 1429, Orléans had become the true heart of French resistance. the last desperate outpost preventing the English from completely absorbing northern France. Strategically located on the banks of the Loire, Orléans played an absolutely crucial role for both sides of the conflict. For the English, its capture meant the ability to invade central France unhindered and continue their advance south, practically guaranteeing complete and ultimate control over the entire country. For the French, Orléans was the last barely standing wall separating them from final, irreversible defeat. The city had been under severe English siege since October 1428. English forces, numbering around 5,000 men under the command of experienced but arrogant commanders, such as the Earl of Salisbury, and later William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk, surrounded Orléans with formidable fortifications and impregnable bastions, completely cutting off all access to the city. The English tactic was simple and horrifyingly brutal. To starve the city into submission by completely cutting off its supplies of food and reinforcements. The garrison and residents resisted desperately, but their strength dwindled day by day. Water and food supplies were running out, and diseases, caused by unsanitary conditions and a catastrophic lack of food, began to spread rapidly among the population. Inside the city walls, an atmosphere of mounting, all-consuming despair reigned. Although the defenders tried their utmost to maintain steadfastness and courage, panic and despondency inevitably spread among the residents. People ate whatever they could find. Grain became worth its weight in gold. Meat virtually disappeared. They had to forage for anything usable, including roots and herbs. Orléans soldiers weakened day by day, yet with incredible tenacity, they daily repelled English attacks and sorties. The city's fortifications were held together, literally by a thread, and the immense fortitude of its last defenders. I saw how the English felt so confident and immune from punishment that they openly mocked the city's defenders. Right beneath Orléans walls, they held boisterous feasts, loudly celebrated their victories, scoffed at the starving French, and even organized nightly tournaments. These actions were not merely amusement, but a cruel psychological warfare, aimed at breaking the defenders' spirit and hastening their surrender. The situation in Orléans was so dire that many of Charles VII's advisors considered the city virtually hopelessly lost. Within the Dauphin's circle, heated, fierce debates persisted about whether it was even worth trying to save the city, or if it would be better to abandon it and conserve precious resources and troops for the defense of southern territories. The Dauphin Charles VII himself was in agonizing indecision and deep doubt, fully understanding that the loss of Orléans would definitively discredit him in the eyes of the people and completely destroy the morale of all Frenchmen. Meanwhile, the people of France, anxiously following the siege of Orléans, were in a state of profound despair and complete helplessness. The city had become not just a military objective, but a sacred symbol of resistance against the invaders. If Orléans were to fall, it would signify the spiritual collapse of the entire country. Residents of other cities, witnessing the impotence of the French army and king, could easily capitulate without a single fight. The English understood this perfectly. That is why they so persistently sought to capture the city. And so, at this critical final moment of despair for the French, the arrival of Joan of Arc became a completely unexpected, divine turn of fate. The very idea that a fragile peasant girl could influence the outcome of the war seemed utterly absurd and incredible in those days. But it was precisely thanks to this incredible absurdity and Joan's own exceptional, unshakable faith that her appearance made an overwhelming impression on French society and on the weary army. News that Joan, God's messenger, as ordinary people immediately began to call her, was approaching the city instantly spread among the defenders and residents of Orléans. Hungry, exhausted, and desperate people felt a surge of hope once more, seeing in her a sign that God had not abandoned them. This return of faith became arguably a more potent weapon than any troops or war machines. Thus, by early 1429, Orléans was not merely a key strategic point on the map of the 100 Years' War, but also the place where the very fate of an entire nation was being decided. The city stood on the brink of an abyss, and its fall would have signified the ultimate collapse of all France. It was in this final, desperate minute that Joan of Arc appeared, a woman destined to change the course of history and inspire not only the weary soldiers of Orléans but all of France to fight, When Joan of Arc entered Orléans on April 29, 1429, the city had already been under a brutal, exhausting siege by English forces for about 7 months. The defenders of Orléans were utterly exhausted by constant fighting, inhuman hunger, and deadly diseases. English detachments, numbering around 5,000 men under the command of experienced but arrogant commanders like William de la Pole and John Talbot, were absolutely confident of their imminent victory. They controlled almost all approaches to the city and had erected an entire system of powerful fortifications and impregnable bastions around Orléans, virtually cutting it off entirely from the outside world. The French themselves knew deep down that without a miracle, the city was doomed. The morale of Orléans defenders was so low that it barely flickered, and so at this dramatic, hopeless moment, the arrival of a young peasant girl with no military experience seemed almost absurd, but Joan's appearance became precisely the long-awaited miracle that both residents and soldiers had desperately hoped for. Her words were simple, yet they resonated with such power that they pierced souls. "God has sent me to save the city." Soldiers, weary from endless defeats and thousands of deaths, suddenly felt that it was through Joan that true hope for deliverance had come to them. One of Joan's first acts in Orléans was an immediate meeting with the defense commanders. Among them were celebrated, experienced commanders: Jean de Dunois, known as the Bastard of Orléans, the famous Captain La Hire, Marshal Gilles de Rais, and others. Despite their initial profound skepticism, they were astonished by the girl's iron determination and absolute self-assurance. She immediately demanded an end to all defensive tactics and an immediate shift to an active, merciless offensive against the English, which completely contradicted the cautious wait-and-see advice of the commanders. Her persistence and passionate, unshakable conviction made such an impression that soon the military leaders, as if under a spell, agreed to trust her. I know that Joan was always in the thick of battles, but an interesting fact is that she never once fought with a weapon in her hands. Her sword, miraculously found at her request in the Church of St. Catherine of Fierbois, was more a sacred symbol than an actual combat tool. According to historical accounts, Joan never wielded it, preferring instead to carry her battle standard. On this snow-white standard embroidered with golden lilies, symbols of France, the names of Jesus and Mary were inscribed. Joan sincerely believed that her purpose was not to kill enemies but to inspire soldiers with her unshakable faith, fearless courage, and unearthly spiritual power. During battles, Joan was in the most dangerous, deadly areas, waving her standard and encouraging soldiers with her voice and personal example of absolute bravery. Soldiers recounted that her fearlessness and selflessness inspired them to feats they had never before imagined possible. Once, during the assault on English fortifications, Joan was seriously wounded by an arrow in the shoulder. However, after receiving prompt first aid, she, overcoming the pain, got back on her feet and continued to inspire the warriors to further desperate attacks. The most decisive, pivotal event during the siege was the legendary battle for Les Tourelles, a powerful English bastion on the banks of the Loire, considered virtually impregnable. On May 7, 1429, Joan personally led this decisive, deadly assault. French soldiers, previously demoralized and convinced of inevitable defeat, now with extraordinary, almost fanatical courage and desperation, hurled themselves at the enemy fortifications. The English were so stunned and disoriented by this sudden, furious ferocity of the French that they failed to hold their positions. Les Tourelles fell, and with it, all English confidence that the city would soon surrender collapsed. The next day, May 8, 1429, the English army, having completely lost initiative and morale, was forced to ignominiously lift the siege and retreat. For all of France, this victory became an enormous, jubilant event, the first serious, tangible French victory in many years of exhausting war. The people immediately named Joan the Maid of Orléans, and her fame spread throughout the country like wildfire. The victory at Orléans became an absolute turning point in the entire 100 Years' War, and restored to the French people a deep, forgotten faith in the possibility of liberating the country from English occupation. After the victory at Orléans, Joan was surrounded by universal respect and veneration, but her conduct in battles remained unchanged. She never participated in bloodshed nor personally killed. She retained the role of a spiritual leader, a person whose strength lay solely in faith and personal example, and whose standard became a sacred symbol of France's liberation and rebirth. After the triumphant coronation in Reims, which marked the undisputed pinnacle of Joan of Arc's glory, a completely unexpected fateful turning point arrived. It would seem that now the king should have unreservedly trusted his savior and fully relied on her authority and support. However, it was precisely after this dizzying victory that relations between Joan and Charles VII began to rapidly cool, gradually escalating into complete estrangement. There were several reasons for such a tragic distancing. Firstly, after the coronation, Charles VII gained unprecedented self-confidence. Now, officially becoming the legitimate recognized king of France, he began to feel completely independent of Joan's influence. To many at court, it seemed that Joan, a girl of humble origin, had gained too boundless an influence on state affairs and on the king himself. The courtiers themselves, high-born aristocrats and cunning advisers, accustomed to behind-the-scenes intrigues and political maneuvering, were mortally jealous of her incredible popularity and panically feared her authority among the people and soldiers. Moreover, after the brilliant victory in Orléans and the coronation in Reims, Joan insisted on the immediate continuation of active aggressive operations against the English and Burgundians. She demanded an immediate continuation of the offensive to liberate Paris and other strategically important cities. But new influential figures emerged at court, advocating for a cautious, less aggressive tactic, believing that the successes achieved were already sufficient, and that it was now time to consolidate gains, avoiding unnecessary risks. Charles VII, always cautious and prone to agonizing doubts, gradually leaned towards the position of these courtiers, who convinced him that Joan's influence had become excessive and even dangerous. Her unyielding will and straightforwardness began to overtly irritate the king and his retinue. As a result, the king ceased actively supporting her military initiatives and increasingly listened to the advice of those courtiers who considered Joan a dangerous, uncontrollable figure capable of undermining their own influence. This estrangement did not manifest immediately, but gradually became absolutely obvious to Joan herself. She was increasingly not invited to military councils. Her fervent pleas for new military actions were ignored or sharply rejected, and the king began conspicuously avoiding personal meetings. For Joan, who sincerely believed that her mission was to liberate all of France to the last inch of land, such treatment became a most severe, unbearable ordeal. An interesting historical fact concerns how the coronation ceremony of Charles VII in Reims itself unfolded, and what unusual, deeply symbolic rituals were used to confirm the new monarch's legitimacy. French tradition was inextricably linked to religious rites, and the coronation held the deepest spiritual significance. Beyond the classic anointing ritual with holy oil, brought from a legendary ampulla said to have been sent from heaven by an angel for the baptism of the first Christian king of the Franks, Clovis, there were other striking rituals. One of the most unusual rites was a special symbolic act where several noble representatives of the clergy and nobility publicly affirmed, before thousands gathered in the cathedral, that they recognized Charles as the legitimate monarch. These individuals addressed the people with special, solemn speeches and direct questions. "Do you recognize this man as your lawful king?" And the people had to publicly, vociferously give their approval and recognition, loudly shouting, "Yes, we do." This ritual held immense symbolic significance, as it underscored the unbreakable unity of the people, clergy, and aristocracy in recognizing the monarch. Another interesting aspect of the ceremony was the ancient tradition of presenting special symbolic regalia, such as the royal sword, golden spurs, crown, and scepter, which conveyed to the new king not only power, but also the sacred responsibility to protect the people and the church. Charles VII received these attributes from the hands of the highest ecclesiastical hierarchs, which signified his unbreakable commitment to protect France and the faith from all enemies. Thus, the coronation itself was a most powerful, sacred symbol of the unity of the people and their monarch. But despite this unity evident at the moment of triumph, the subsequent cooling and estrangement of the king from Joan became one of the most dramatic and bitter episodes of her history, leading subsequently to the tragic, merciless end of her great mission. After relations between Joan of Arc and Charles VII began to deteriorate, she found herself in an extremely difficult, vulnerable situation. Despite the king's noticeably cooler attitude towards her, Joan had no intention of abandoning her sacred mission. Her primary goal remained the complete, unconditional liberation of France from the English invaders and their allies. It was with this unquenchable resolve that she embarked on a new military campaign northward, into lands occupied by the forces of the Duke of Burgundy, who was a staunch ally of the English. In the spring of 1430, Joan was in Compiègne, a strategically important city located on the Oise River. This city was a key defensive point against the forces of the Duke of Burgundy and the English, who desperately sought to regain lost positions and halt the French advance. On May 23, 1430, the fateful battle occurred, becoming a tragic, irreversible turning point in Joan's destiny. On that day, Joan, along with a small detachment of brave warriors, rode out from the fortress of Compiègne, attempting to launch a sudden, audacious attack on the Burgundian positions. The plan was simple: deliver a quick and unexpected strike, demoralize the enemy, and push them further away from the city walls. But during this sortie, everything went completely wrong. The Burgundian soldiers proved better prepared and organized than expected. The French detachment under Joan's leadership met with much stronger resistance and was forced to retreat in panic back towards the gates of Compiègne. It was at this critical, fatal moment that a grave error occurred. For a reason still unclear and disputed, the city gates unexpectedly, with a screech, closed right in front of Joan and her closest comrades. This prevented her from taking refuge inside the fortress and made escape from the pursuing enemies impossible. Joan and a small group of her supporters found themselves literally trapped between the closed gates and the pressing Burgundians. The skirmish was brief but incredibly fierce. Despite desperate resistance, Joan was heroically captured by a Burgundian soldier, a crossbowman named Lionel from Wandon. The question of why Compiègne's gates suddenly closed precisely at the moment Joan was returning remains one of the most mysterious and hotly disputed episodes of her biography to this day. Some historians believe it was simply a tragic mistake or an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by panic or a lack of coordination among the city's defenders. Others, with far greater justification, suggest that Joan might have become the victim of a carefully planned trap set by her hidden adversaries, including some French courtiers who desperately wished to get rid of such an overly influential and inconvenient figure. These suspicions are bolstered by the fact that after Joan's capture, none of the French commanders made serious attempts to free her or ransom her from captivity, although such opportunities undoubtedly existed. King Charles VII essentially stood aside, doing almost nothing to save her, which cast a dark stain on his reputation. This raised many questions and justified suspicions among contemporaries and historians alike. Thus, Joan's final battle at Compiègne remains a mysterious and deeply ambiguous page in her life. Was it a tragic accident, a fatal military error, or the result of deliberate base treachery? This question still has no definitive answer. Only one thing is clear: Joan's capture opened the door to the last, most tragic stage of her life, culminating in a dismal trial and a horrific execution, which forever made her one of the most dramatic and inspiring figures in world history. After Joan found herself imprisoned beneath the walls of Compiègne, the entire French populace and army anxiously awaited an immediate reaction from King Charles VII and his entourage. It seemed obvious that the monarch should exert every possible effort to free the heroine who had played a pivotal role in his coronation, and literally saved France from complete, inevitable catastrophe. However, the complete opposite occurred. Charles VII and his close associates did almost nothing, absolutely nothing, to save Joan from captivity. The main bitter reason for such behavior lay in the complex, toxic political situation at the French court. After the coronation, Charles VII felt confident enough to begin listening to those courtiers who from the outset had viewed Joan as an annoying impediment and a direct threat to their own influence. These individuals envied her incredible popularity among the people and soldiers, considering her a dangerous, unpredictable figure capable of undermining their own standing at court, and even the king himself. they cunningly and persistently convinced Charles VII that supporting Joan was no longer sensible and even dangerous, as it could lead to undesirable conflicts with England and Burgundy, with whom many at court secretly dreamed of forging a beneficial compromise peace. Particularly important, and indeed pivotal, was the role of Burgundy. At that time, Duke Philip the Good, the ruler of Burgundy, formally remained an ally of the English, but in practice pursued his own selfish political and economic interests, skillfully maneuvering between the warring parties. When Joan fell into Burgundian captivity, the Duke quickly, with devilish astuteness, realized that he had gained a priceless instrument for political bargaining. He knew perfectly well the high symbolic value of Joan for both the English and the French, and therefore decided to extract maximum benefit from it. The Burgundians immediately put Joan up for sale as an extremely valuable captive. The English instantly, greedily seized upon this opportunity. For them, Joan's capture was an incredible, unprecedented stroke of luck, as the girl, considered a living symbol of French resistance, could be not merely neutralized, but cynically used to discredit Charles VII himself. The English well understood that a public trial of Joan and her subsequent execution could deal a most powerful, devastating blow to French national consciousness and the spirit of resistance. The deal between the English and the Burgundians was concluded quite quickly, almost instantly. The English paid an exorbitant, enormous sum for Joan, by the standards of the time 10,000 livres tournois. To grasp the true scale of this sum, it's worth noting that it could support a large military detachment for several months. Such a high price was due not merely to the captive's military significance, but to her colossal symbolic and political importance. Joan was not merely a living symbol, she was the embodiment of French resistance. Her name was known in every French village, and her capture would be a huge, irreparable moral blow to the French. Having paid this price, the English immediately transported Joan to Rouen, the center of their French territories, where she was to appear before an ecclesiastical court organized and entirely controlled by the English authorities. The main objective of this disgraceful trial was to prove that Joan was a heretic and a sorceress, thereby forever destroying her reputation and undermining the authority of the French king, whom, in their view, she had elevated to the throne only with the help of devilish powers. After Joan of Arc fell into English hands, she was taken to the city of Rouen, the ominous center of English power in the occupied French lands. There, she was to appear before a trial that would forever be known as the Rouen trial. This event became one of the most disgraceful and cynical episodes of the 100 Years' War, serving as a glaring example of how justice could be ruthlessly manipulated for sordid political aims. The Rouen trial began in January 1431. The court was officially ecclesiastical, but effectively a puppet court, headed by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, a man closely connected to and entirely controlled by the English administration. In reality, the entire process was a meticulously organized, abhorrent sham, whose primary goal was not to establish truth, but to maximally discredit Joan, declaring her a heretic and an ungodly sorceress. Joan was accused of a host of monstrous crimes, the principal one, of course, being heresy, meaning deviation from official church doctrine. Other major charges included witchcraft, wearing men's clothing, which was considered a grave sin by the church canons of the time, disobedience to ecclesiastical authorities, and falsely claiming to receive revelations from God. The judges made every effort to portray Joan as a dangerous witch, an instrument of the devil, who deliberately misled people and flagrantly violated the sacred tenets of the church. Throughout the trial, the judges employed numerous cunning stratagems and treacherous base tactics, attempting to confuse Joan, make her commit a mistake, or elicit a statement that could be interpreted as an admission of guilt.